I want to think about that Kantian conception that justice requires equal treatment. Similar cases are to be treated similarly. We want everybody to be judged and evaluated by rules that apply to everyone. And so we should act only on that maxim we can will as a universal law. So that's going to require that we treat people equally. Now, of course, that's not the full content of Kant's view. Kant says these have to be things that a rational person could accept. These have to be things we could rationally will as a universal law. But for now, I want to focus on the equality aspect. You might think it's enough to say that means the same rule has to apply to everyone. But in the law, more is required than that. That's how it starts, and indeed a law that applies equally to all groups and specifies only things relevant to the position is known as facially neutral. It doesn't discriminate against men or against women, against someone of any given race or ethnicity. We don't simply require that criteria be facially neutral. The law goes beyond that and is concerned with something known as disparate impact. The idea is this: some things that are facially neutral, don't appear discriminatory on their face, have a discriminatory effect, have disparate impact on various groups, and so end up applying very differently to different genders, for example, or to different racial groups, or to different religious groups, etc. There are two key components to contemporary law about this. The first is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What is an adverse impact? It's defined as a substantially different rate of selection in hiring, promotion, or other employment decisions, which works to the disadvantage of members of a race, sex, or ethnic group. The question then is, could this be justified? Sometimes the answer is yes. The criterion in Griggs is business necessity. Sometimes you can say, but look, I understand that this criterion has a disparate impact, but the practice is a business necessity. I need for people to have these skills. And sometimes that's legitimate. Now, of course, necessity is a very high bar to meet. Very hard to prove that somebody has to have that particular condition satisfied. And so in practice, that's meant this has to be substantially related to the job. This has to be something that has a substantial relationship with job performance, with the required skills for that position. So, in the case of truck drivers, for example, applying to Duke Power Company, the court held that passing high school and having a high school diploma or passing some kind of IQ test was not really required. It was not something that was a business necessity, and even by the later criterion, they would have argued it was not substantially related to the requirements of the job. Well, there are a number of tests that are often used for this. The most common one, the simplest one, that the EEOC recommends is called the 80% rule. If the rate of passing of one group is at least 80% the rate of another group, then that's viewed as acceptable variation. But if it's less than 80%, the idea is that that qualifies as an adverse impact, and so may be evidence of a disparate impact. That turns out to be quite a stringent condition, as we'll see later. So I want to come back to that question. What sets the 80% criterion? Well, it's more or less arbitrary. But it's only one factor. People do a lot of practical analyses of what this really means for various groups. They do sometimes very sophisticated statistical analyses and look to conditions of statistical significance. In any case, there's an attempt to say how large a difference is there and what factors might we use to explain that variation. Are they things that have a substantial business relationship to the position that is being sought, for example, or the promotion that is being sought, to, in short, the various things that we are trying to select for? Well, the idea is that a statistical difference, in effect, in other words, is prima facie evidence of discrimination. Does it really indicate discriminatory intent? Well, maybe. There are lots of other factors. That's why it's important to do sophisticated analyses so that we can try to see whether factors that do have a substantial relationship to job performance might explain quite a bit of the variation. Well, there are a number of issues here. Practical issues about how to apply this, and also moral issues about the legitimacy of this kind of consideration. But now looking at outcomes at the effects on various groups and the results of applying whatever employment practice we're talking about yields different results, we end up having to make a choice. We can either treat people equally or we can seek equal outcomes. We can't do both. You would think, ideally, we do both in the real world. We might care about both. But the fact is they often contradict one another. Groups come with very different degrees of preparation, different cultural values, different skill sets, sometimes just different physical characteristics. And so there's simply a question of which we care about more, applying the same condition across the board or getting equal outcomes. We often have to make a choice. And so to the extent that we're committed to the Kantian ideal of having universal maxims that apply all the way across the board to everyone, we're going to think that actually a concern for disparate impact might be misplaced, at least in a lot of circumstances, where it can't be taken as direct evidence that there is some sort of discriminatory intent or discriminatory practice underlying this. A second factor is that in practice it turns out to be hard to apply in a lot of cases because there really are dramatic differences. Some of the most dramatic do stem from physical differences between men and women, for example. And so in the case of firefighters or in the case of military personnel, combat roles especially, that it's very difficult to achieve equal performance among groups when you apply the same criterion across the board to everyone. It's important for a firefighter to have a certain amount of upper body strength to be able to carry somebody out of a burning building, for example. It's important in a combat role for somebody to be able to carry a wounded comrade, or for someone to be able to crawl under barbed wire, to climb over walls that are meant to keep them out, that are meant to overcome various obstacles, move logs and so on that might be in the way of a vehicle. Those differences in upper body strength that are relevant lead to disparate impact between men and women for tests for a lot of those roles. So what do? Do we end up saying, well, it's okay, we're applying the same rule to everyone, we don't care about disparate impact in this case because after all there really is some substantial relationship to performance? Or do we say we do care about the equality of outcome, and so actually we're going to change the criteria for being a firefighter or for being a combat infantryman? There are other kinds of cases like that. So for example, it might be that we're hiring for positions at a university in the engineering school, and it turns out that people from different ethnic and racial groups have PhDs in engineering at very different rates. So we might look around and find, for example, that most of the applicants, most of the people with PhDs in engineering who are interested in such a position are either white or Asian. What do we do about that? It looks like if we apply the same criterion across the board, and it does appear to have a substantial relationship to performance, we're going to end up with very different group representation. Should we be worried about that? How much should we be worried about that? There are other complicated questions here. When we think about hiring decisions of that kind or promotion decisions, we have to think, well, which of these criteria really do matter to doing that job, to earning that promotion and so on? And often we will find that different groups are represented very differently. We'll have to decide what really counts as equity in those kinds of circumstances. The same kind of issue arises when it comes to questions of college admissions. People from different racial and ethnic backgrounds fare very differently, not only in high school, but also in taking SAT tests, ACT tests, in other measures of performance. And so what do we do about those differences? Maybe they reflect differences in ability, maybe they reflect differences in educational background, maybe there are other factors that enter into them, and so the inputs are sometimes suspect. But we also can think, well, look, to the extent that these have a substantial relationship, they're going to produce unequal representation. And so how do we deal with that? What do we do about it? This, of course, generates a huge issue about affirmative action programs and other kinds of programs that are meant to attract people who are underrepresented in an area to that area. There are complicated questions here about which groups matter. So, for example, in college admissions, people worry a lot about differences between whites, Asians, African Americans, and Hispanics, for example. But on the other hand, gaps between people of Jamaican descent, for example, and African Americans who have been in this country a long time and ultimately came from West Africa tends to be large. It tends to be larger, actually, than the overall white-black gap. And the same is true on other sides, for example, between people of English descent and people of Polish descent. And so are those things that we should be concerned about? Should we be concerned with the representation of Polish Americans or Italian Americans? And should we be worried about the proportion of Jamaicans, for example, as opposed to other African American groups? All of those are questions that it's hard to sort out, and it's hard to say how much all of those things matter. There are similar controversies about the relevance and legitimacy of things like criminal background checks or credit reports and credit checks. For a variety of positions, those are thought to be important. We require criminal background checks typically for childcare workers, for people working around money, for people in a variety of different positions in law enforcement, for example. But on the other hand, those do have a disparate impact on groups. So some people want to ban asking questions about those. So far, the empirical evidence indicates that if you do that kind of thing, and people really do care about that criterion, they actually discriminate more, not less. They start suspecting everybody of a given group where there is an overrepresentation of undesirable traits from the point of view of somebody hiring for that position. And so these are complicated moral questions. I don't think there are simple answers to them. There's one last moral complication I want to talk about, and that is the possibility of being damned if you do and damned if you don't. There was a case, Ricci versus De Stefano, 2009 case involving the New Haven Fire Department. 19 white and 1 Hispanic firefighter passed a test for promotion, but as it happened, given the criterion for not only passing the test, but for being among the top people who passed the test and thereby qualifying for the promotion, no African American applicants ended up meeting that criterion. And so the New Haven Fire Department decided to promote no one rather than promote only white and Hispanic officers. Those who were turned down for promotion thought that they had been treated unequally and so brought a lawsuit against the city. They ended up winning in a 5-4 decision before the Supreme Court. And so in this case, the New Haven Fire Department feared a lawsuit if it went ahead and granted those promotions when there appeared to be a disparate impact, even though they had subjected their tests to extensive study with respect to these questions. But nevertheless, they, not irrationally, I think, feared that they would be sued under the disparate impact theory. However, by not making a decision, they ended up getting sued by those who were passed over under the disparate impact theory, and the Supreme Court decided in their favor. The 5 justices who formed the majority argued that the city should have defended its test, that it had been subject to extensive study, that a big part of it was actually being interviewed by and having to go on jobs with people who were already in the position of lieutenant or captain, and so being judged by those actually in those positions as being well qualified for that job. And so it wasn't just a paper test, it was really actually being interviewed by people who knew exactly what the qualifications were. And so the majority said, look, it is possible to have something that has an apparent adverse impact if there is a justification for it. And in this case, there was. So you should have gone ahead. And you really were having an adverse impact on these officers by refusing to apply your own criteria. The minority, however, said it may be so important to have people in minority positions in leadership roles that you should have ignored your own criteria and actually used a different criterion and promoted people to lieutenant or captain, even though they didn't meet the criterion and didn't outperform others on the test. In any case, you can see how the New Haven Fire Department ended up feeling as if they were caught between Scylla and Charybdis here. There was no way to win. They were going to be hit with a lawsuit no matter what. And that does seem like a problem. One last point. I mentioned that 80% rule is actually extremely stringent. And there are 2 factors here. One is that statistically, it turns out that kind of variation, especially in relatively small groups, is extremely easy to achieve. It's turning out, really, that almost always a statistical analysis ends up showing there's a disparate impact whenever there's any variation that is greater than that. And in short, really anything neutrally applied to groups that simply have natural variation in them is going to end up looking like it flunks the criterion. There is another consideration as well, which is that all sorts of factors go into this. Think about salary levels and the kinds of criteria we talked about, the dozens really of criteria we talked about last time. It's very hard to take all those things into account, and it's very rare that a statistical analysis considers all of the possible confounding variables. But there are typically many of those confounding variables, and it's hard to really know whether a study has ruled them out or not. So it's possible for a study to show very widely different levels of statistical significance, for example, based simply on what variables it includes. You can shape it to look like there's nothing left to be explained, or you can shape it so that there's a lot left to be explained and a lot that looks problematic, depending on which variables you choose and how you measure them. So in short, there are a lot of very complicated empirical questions and moral questions surrounding this sort of issue. I don't mean to suggest here that there are any easy answers to these, but this is something you need to think very seriously about when you think about questions of justice and contemplate what appropriate criteria of justice are.